second paying off.
Okay, we're here with Bill Barnett, property guru, should we call you, for Phuket. Just a little bit about your background first, people who don't know you, where you came from and how you came to get this position here as a consultant guru.
I've been here, I've been in Asia 26 years. Certainly I've worked in all the Asian markets in hospitality and in property. C9 hotelworks has been in Phuket for the past 9 years. We've done a lot of projects here, certainly in terms of mixed use. We do work throughout the region in terms of hospitality and property consulting. So we do a lot of work on mixed use projects as well. My background was Deputy Managing Director for Laguna Phuket, which is one of the largest development companies on the island, but certainly we work with a lot of international developers as well. We work in Bali, certainly we work in Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Thailand, but Phuket remains our home.
Right. C9 hotelworks is your main company. Why C9, by the way?
C9 is Cloud9. We're a hospitality company at our roots in Cloud9. Certainly, it's a good night's sleep.
So you feel you're on top of the world, so to speak?
Well, certainly living in Phuket, I think it's a top place to live, so we are on top of the world.
All right. And your other website, PhuketInsider, do you really have this inside information from all your previous contacts or also your current sort of clients?
I think we try with the PhuketInsider to put something back into our industry. I think that's always important. We have a good business here. This is our roots here. We consult on so many projects. Over the years, we've done probably 40 to 50 projects on the island. We talk to the international hotel groups and we interface with that, so certainly we have good knowledge. I think it's important to get out reputable figures and certainly a good business forum, which talk about hospitality and property and tourism issues. So we like to think that we're probably, our reports provide a firm basis for outside investment and for people seeing what's real in Phuket. Certainly in our work, we do have access to a lot of data out there, and so we collect data on a regular basis, both for projects and independently. But we publish these reports really not because we need the PR, we have a good client base, but simply as a service back to Phuket. We're trying to put something back in and raise the bar of information here, and to provide a platform for people what they would expect, whether they be in Singapore or Hong Kong, but certainly in Phuket, to say what's real in the marketplace, what transactions are happening, what's news is out there. So it's a lot of extra work, but I think it's important to, as I said, to service our industry and put something back.
Well, you've just brought out recently your hotel market update for the mid-year. How much work does it you have to put into it?
Certainly it's a lot of work. I mean, over the past few years we've been producing the C9 hotel market reports certainly on a regular basis. We try to get these every 6 months. So we go back and we really try to provide these for hoteliers and for tourism people to look back at what the real numbers are. We're tracking airport arrivals, we're tracking tourism trends, we're tracking what hotels are in the pipeline and how the operating hotels are performing. So it's really an analytical piece, really providing a real picture, our boots on the ground figures of what's happening in Phuket. So I think that's important. It takes a lot of time. We go out there, we collect figures. This isn't a for-profit. We distribute it in the Phuket Gazette. We distribute it to a wide variety of people. We write articles. I write for the Phuket Gazette. I write for The Nation as well and a lot of other magazines. So it's important to get the word out about what's happening in the marketplace.
How sure can you be that the figures you get from, say, the hotels are genuine?
We triangulate information. I mean, that's, any kind of market research, you have to recheck and double check figures. We have a good amount of historical data as well. We work with a number of the international hotel chains. I think in terms of broad-based data, our data is amongst the best in the marketplace, certainly. We work certainly with the Airport Authority, with the AOT, and with the various, with the Department of Tourism and Sports as well. We can see how figures move on a basis, so, we can really perhaps do analytical data, what data is out there and saying what's real and what's not. Mm-hmm. In terms of tourism data, I think Thailand is quite good in terms of the airport data, the AOT data, and the immigration figures. We see consistency in that. We can take that information, look back at the hotel occupancies and see how that's being derived from. So, it's about as good as you're going to get in this market.
Okay. So what are the main highlights you come out with just recently? I
think something is certainly that we're anticipating, actually AOT is anticipating by the end of this year that we're going to have a new all-time high for airport arrivals. That's a composition of arrivals at the airport, be it domestic or be international. We're looking at 4 million. That's going to be the highest figure ever. Last year was 3.2, which is a record year as well. So I think that's going to be a big growth figure. That's going to be well over 20% from last year, year-on-year growth. And it's a good number.
You're talking about just international, not Thai tourists?
International and domestic. International and domestic arrivals by air. It's hard to triangulate and get information about arrivals by bus or by boat, but the airport arrival figure correlates to tourism overall. Some people, there's often confusion. People see figures about total airport passengers. They see figures of 6-7 million. Now these are departures and arrivals. So again,
it should be half of that.
It's been 3.2 has been the historical high, and now we're going for 4 million in 2011. I think what's important for us, and we've seen a big boost certainly, is in direct flights. We're seeing more charter flight service. We're seeing a little more low-cost carrier service and more direct flights. That's really spurring a volume-based model.
But is anyone counting, say, the car, vehicle, tourists, as well as the boat and the ships?
You're not.
Cruise?
That's quite difficult to in terms of most of the shipping business, how that comes in. That's really attracting. They're staying on the ships. They're coming and doing day tours and going back. The other figures that would somehow equate back to that would be the occupancy figures at the hotels. We get figures from the tourism officials as well as from the hotels. We look at occupancy on that. But to try to get numbers actually arriving in Phuket at the bridge and say, where are you staying, where are you going, that's quite difficult to track. But if we somehow look at airport arrivals, domestic and international, and we go backwards and also look at hotel occupancy, those are going to be the two really indicative figures that are going to matter.
All right. I think you said Patong, you reckon at the moment, it's 82% occupancy.
For the first half of the year,
For the first half of the year.
Yeah.
That seems incredibly high.
Patong, again, we're dealing with tourist class hotels. Patong has really been the superstar of the market. When we're looking at the hotel pipeline, and the growth of Patong, within 5 years, Patong is going to account for 50% of the hotel rooms on the entire island. Certainly when we're seeing trading in that area, Patong certainly is out trading the entire area in terms of its product. We've seen Patong, whereby the island, over the past few years, we've seen kind of a retraction to more of a seasonal trading, but Patong has somehow outperformed that. It's trading month on month, from strength to strength.
But are you really including, say, all the guest houses and condominiums, apartments?
We're including hotels.
Just hotels.
Correct. We're looking at hotels. Once you go down
from 1, 2 star.
We're looking at basically registered hotels, which would start at budgeted economy hotels all the way up to deluxe hotels. So if you're looking at guest houses and other things, you can't track occupancy in those. It's quite difficult. But it's quite in terms of our data on the hotels there, it's quite solid in terms of how they're performing. There's high occupancy, but again, it's come at a price, which is rates. I think that's what everybody's talking about, what's going to happen to rates. And we've seen, interesting in the Russia and China are now 25% of the market, and that's certainly Phuket. After the global financial crisis, things changed. Phuket had been quite not necessarily dominated by Eurocentric customers, but certainly there was a large degree of Europeans who come and bask on the beach. But certainly we saw more domestic travelers and Asian-based travelers after the global financial crisis. We think that's going to not change for the next decade.
But do you mean that hoteliers can't really charge as much as they like for Russians and Chinese?
Correct. I think we're, somehow things always are cyclical within the hospitality business. We're going back to the days of the 80s and 90s when wholesalers and large-scale travel companies are at their heights of their power because you have emerging markets. When you have emerging markets like China or Eastern Europe, not just Russia, but Eastern Europe, you have these large wholesalers like Pegasus Touristic who are controlling large groups of first-time travelers. First-time travelers come in package tourism. Package tourism comes at volume, and volume sells at lower prices. So it's very hard to put rates up in terms of those
So is this a bad thing?
I think it's reality. This is not any different than we saw that happened in markets like Bali. We've seen it all over Southeast Asia within the tourism markets where you've seen room rates soften as the mix changes. As the mix changes, the Europeans who might be paying higher room rates are going with Asians. Asians also, volume comes at a different level in terms of the hospitality dynamic that we look at as the average length of stay. For Europeans, average length of stay was much higher. They used to come and stay 5+ days, right? With Asian travelers, they tend to stay 2-3 days. They travel more often, take shorter vacations, but they spend less. So it's simply the trend. I think what's important is, we're getting the tourists where the tourism are traveling right now. So it's pointless to sit around and waiting with empty hotel rooms saying, we hope the tourists will come back. Really you have to tap into a market saying right now, Asia's the whole focal point. We look at the global phenomenon, more than 50% of Airbus and Boeing aircraft on order are coming to Asia. So it's really, 8 hours and beyond, that's where tourists are going to be for the next generation. So we have to adjust our market to that.
Looking at the whole island then, do you think hoteliers and the tourism market are worried about the houses, the villas, the condominiums, the apartments that also provide rooms for tourists?
I think you're seeing certainly the condo hotels. We're seeing the same thing in Bali right now. We're doing work in Bali right now. There's over 5,000 condo hotels under development. The case in point, would these be, when they come into the hotel stream, it's going to be a tremendous impact. I think right now in Phuket, there's a lot of discussion really with the condo hotels about trying to get these within the revenue stream of the revenue department and get them to paying hotel taxes. I think really there's a lot of reform needed in terms of providing hotel licenses to villa estates and to condo hotels. I think that's an important issue, but to bring that back in. But certainly they're displacing business from traditional hotels. And especially more, you take a case like the Outrigger Laguna Village, they're able to sell pool villas at quite a reasonable price because these are privately owned. It's a real estate offering, and they've been able to penetrate a market against traditional hotels. Okay. So I think certainly that's a factor in displacing traditional hotel business.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the general housing market then, of real estate, is it a good place to still buy property here and invest and live?
I think people have to take a longer term view when they realize that, Phuket in the past, resort grade real estate, there's two types of real estate here, which would be the Thai domestic market, would be the inland properties, which are primarily for people working at a low pricing point from say, 1.5 million baht up to 4 or 5 million baht. And then you have resort grade real estate. I mean, resort grade real estate has traditionally in Phuket relied on large-scale foreign demand. After the global financial crisis, that's not always going to exist out there, so you have to track the domestic market. How do you attract Thais to buy here or domestic business elsewhere? You see that in Bangkok. Certainly in Bangkok, the condo market hasn't blipped in the past few years, Hua Hin per se. Phuket went flat because it was unable to attract Thais. So I think right now we're kind of neither, there's fairly flat trading. I mean, fundamentals still are okay in Phuket because you're not seeing people who have bought real estate who have leveraged it. There's not debt. If you go to North America or you go to Europe, people who have bought it, real estate, they're underwater because the values are down. Here people have simply paid cash for a unit, but it's very hard to dispose of. So it's a long-term hold. I think it's a good place to buy, but again, fundamentals, buy in fundamentals, buy oceanfront property, buy in good areas, buy at a reasonable price. But in terms of, I think we're going back to terms where really the primary market for people who wanted to buy real estate in Phuket was either to come and live here full-time or to have a holiday home for use. If you're buying those and you're not expecting to get double-digit inflation, property is not a casino. It's not going to be back like it was in the middle part of last decade where you could go in double-digit capital appreciation. All right.
Well, finally, maybe with this new government here in Thailand, do you expect any major changes to affect mainly the housing market, property market, but also tourism here? And what would you like, or the industry like?
I think we're going to wait and see, in terms of, with Yingluck and Shinawatra, what's happening. We've seen certainly the potential impact of the 300 baht minimum wage increase could be potentially devastating to hospitality. We think that's going to edge inflation. Inflation edges building prices up. What do we want? Certainly, again, there's been, in terms of, it's been sleeping beauty for the past 2 years for how the government's been attracting foreign investment. We'd like to see that the foreign ownership is addressed in some positive way, whether it be 60-year leases, 90-year leases, 99-year leases. The foreign ownership issue is one. Certainly an impetus towards the financial institutions to be able to lend money to foreigners to able to buy property in Thailand. Those are the two biggest stimulation packages we are. The third would be general infrastructure. Right now people are worried about supply demand because the private sector is moving faster than the government. We need mega projects. We need transportation infrastructure. We need these big type of projects. So again, going backwards, more government investment into big infrastructure projects. I guess my biggest impact, going backwards to tourism, would be in Bangkok, the leading change of tourism in the past 20 years was the SkyTrain. It was a big sponsored project and it did extremely well. Phuket needs a big sponsored project which is going to be able to provide infrastructure to the island. That will spur property, that will spur tourism.
Like the light rail project or the convention center?
Light rail or the overpass project or the highway connecting north to south.
Okay, thank you so far. Okay, let's continue, Bill. Also, it's quite complicated, but the crisis in the US with the debts, the EU with also similar problems, and stock markets up and down, very volatile. What effect will all this have on Phuket and the Andaman? Let's not forget the wider region here.
I think mainly what we're looking at would be, in terms of, you have to look at how the US debt crisis is going to affect Asia. not necessarily Thailand, not necessarily Phuket. We had to look at the ripple effect from the US into Asia, the Asian economies, because right now the success of Phuket is bulging on the success of Southeast Asia and how actually Asia-wide, these booming economies, and certainly if there's any blip in that, we'd be most worried about China. Is there a China bubble? And certainly the China-US issue certainly is tremendous, because if China cooled off for some reason and travel stopped, that's certainly going to create a big vacuum in the market. That for us is the biggest potential problem out there. Whether China, at some point nothing goes forever, right? Every boom busts, and certainly the China bubble issue becomes predominant. That kind of concern, how that could impact. I think in terms of Europe, we've mitigated risk. We've seen the European markets move in and out as far as tourism. For property, certainly the impact would be that people who are high net worth individuals are still buying, because they'll buy in any climate they're going to buy, but it's also put some other buyers on the fence. They're saying, what's going to happen next? Is it a good time to buy or not time to buy? So it hasn't stimulated wider recovery. But in terms of high volume transactions, the rich are still buying, but the broad market's not buying. So it's pushed people to the sidelines, and people are saying, what do we do next? So it's not helping the broad property market.
What about the exchange rate for the baht? I mean, I think recently it's strengthened.
It's strengthened. I don't think
dollar
that's,
and
again, it goes
euro.
backwards. Is it the worst thing in the world? I don't know, because, again, we go back to the mid 1990s when, the baht was trading at 25. Was that the worst thing to the US dollar in terms of that? I think people are also looking at, people say it's becoming more expensive, but everywhere in the world is becoming more expensive. Food prices are escalating. Inflation's escalating. I don't think that's the largest problem at the end of the day. Perhaps for a small segment, for the retirement market, they look at the value, but we've not seen a mass exodus of the island. We still see people also, where you've got places like Hong Kong or Singapore, which are getting more expensive, saying Phuket's cheap. Whenever I speak to people, even from Europe, and they look in Phuket and they say, the lifestyle is that much, the cost of living is that much more reasonable. So I think people have to put that in perspective. But it's not a large, long, it's not a huge deterrent right now to the property market with the currency exchange. And I don't think people can say things are going to be the way they were before, because Asia's come a long way. Asia's grown up. So you can't expect that it's always going to be cheap.
Can you forecast it? How do you think it might go, the exchange rate?
I mean, as I said, if I had that knowledge, we'd go backwards. But certainly we could see it potentially trading back into a volume of, could it go back to a level that was in the mid-90s? It's possible. But we saw the potential issue also at what happened in 1997, when it went the other way as well. But in terms of value, certainly, Thailand, in terms of the balance sheet and everything else, it's a strong fundamental. So I think our expectation would be that the baht will continue to strengthen.
But is it fair to say if it went down, if it weakened, it would be better for tourism and property here? Because everything's cheaper. I
don't think it would be that much better for tourism, because people are traveling. You have Australians who are traveling because their currency is strong. They're not going, it's created a vacuum for domestic tourism in Australia. Certainly people like the Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast is suffering. They're gutted because people are going to Bali, they're going to Phuket. They're traveling because they have so much bang for their buck. In some ways it's pushed, Thais who are now traveling to the US or Europe because it's cheaper. In terms of that, if it were dramatically different, do we want that much more volume in the market? I think there's a fair, there's some kind of equality out there right now in terms of that. I don't think that's the short-term answer. If the baht goes back and trades at 40 to 1 to the US dollar, is it going to spur more people to move in? Not necessarily. Because I think there's so much damage within the North American and European systems per se, those people are going to start moving to Thailand in mass. So it's not going to be we really live in a global environment.
You touched on something I forgot to ask earlier about supply. Is there really too many rooms, too many villas, too many houses? And also, let's look at the wider market. Perhaps Phang Nga and Krabi deserve a lot more attention and potential still for future growth.
Phuket certainly,
surely over.
Certainly Phuket is becoming, in terms of supply, but again, it's, people are building hotels, as a safe haven. We're seeing the private sector run wild without government intervention. We're not seeing any regulation. I think, there will be hotels which will be cycled out of the system at the same time. Some of the older hotels will have to either upgrade or they need to convert. So that's going to be a healthy market trend as well. In terms of a greater Phuket, Phang Nga has effectively zoned out tourism. That's been a kind of a unexplainable phenomenon in terms of what's happened from the bridge all the way up to Tai Ma Wong. in terms of the building restrictions and everything else and pushing tourism out. So Phang Nga really, in some ways, is not opening up to international chains because you can't build big hotels. It's very difficult to build hotels over 80 keys because of the post-tsunami legislation, because of the changes of the Town City Planning Act in Tai Muang. So that's really pushed away tourism. Krabi is another issue, and Krabi certainly is, there's demand for it, but again, you know, it's a niche market. We're seeing some movements. We have a Krabi Boat Lagoon, which was, you know, is going to open in November. We've seen some other things happening. Krabi still sees highly seasonal trading. We don't have international schools there yet. You don't have the accompanying infrastructure of Phuket, so it's going to take time to get that in. We're seeing a project, the Pelican, which was launched over in Klong Muang earlier this year. And things are going okay there, but if we look at the trading of Krabi hotels, it continues to be very Eurocentric. You know, the Europeans flock to Koh Lanta, they flock to Krabi for 4 or 5 months a year, then the hotels are empty. So it's not necessarily a healthy trading environment, so people aren't being attracted to go invest into Krabi. I think longer term, you know, Krabi, you know, we like it there, you know, in terms of, you know, the variety. We like that they don't have jet skis. We like you can't put loungers on the beach, you know, the serenity and everything else, but it's not supplying the power of the punch for tourism. It's not attracting people.
What about the price of land? Is it still a lot cheaper than Phuket?
It's not. Beachfront land is not substantially lower, you know, and Phang Nga is not substantially lower. Certainly, you know, if we look at Nat Hai, we look at Ta Sai, we look at Bodan, even going to Khao Lak, you know, pricing is still going at a high level. You know, I think, I guess the only parallel that we see that perhaps is the danger is that you're seeing so many people building Khao Lak who are building 3-star hotels, which aren't going to really enhance the destination. People will only go to Khao Lak because it's cheaper than Phuket. That's not necessarily better for Khao Lak tourism. Krabi is a little different because you have people like the Ritz-Carlton, you have Sofitel, you've got Sheraton, you've got some big entities there, you know, which are trading. You know, their occupancy is much lower than Phuket for similar projects. I think you need a lot more demand generators. You've got the one golf course located south of town and fair ways out. You need more things for people to do as well. But in reality, Krabi is not a large, you know, it can never be Phuket. It shouldn't want to be Phuket. You know, it's an entirely different market. But in terms of, there's not, you know, there are some big land parcels, but they're owned by Thais, and it's going to take them time to develop. But there's not an unlimited supply of land, perhaps the scale of land that we see in Phuket.
You mentioned golf. There's a project in Tai Muang that's going to be redeveloped, isn't there? An old golf course there.
Yeah, that's Richard Lee's project from Hong Kong, PCPD. You know, that continues to be developed, but again, they face the same onus as the Ritz-Carlton project in Phang Nga with the rezoning. The rezoning came last August from the Town and City Planning, which really effectively changed developers' potential to develop large hotels along the beachfront. So really, that's been anti-development. You know, somehow it's spurred, you know, it's really taken things and pushed it back to Phuket, you know, in a negative way. I think it's not necessarily protecting the environment, but, you know, in terms of some ways, it's created lower Phang Nga into a bedroom community for Phuket where people could commute back for jobs and everything else. It hasn't prospered, you know, places like Koh Kloi and Tai Muang are not prospering because of this zoning. You know, basically they're forced, they want good jobs, they've got to come further afield. They don't have 5-star hotels in their area to go be employed by. They don't have the ability to better their lives or trade up in housing or anything else. They're simply living in a bedroom community of Phuket. So it's a second-rate Phuket. I think that's a disservice to a great destination. Phang Nga should be one of the loveliest destinations in Thailand. It has some of the greatest natural attributes. You know, places like Phang Nga Bay, Khao Sok per se, you know, has enormous potential. But there has to be a plan for...
Khao Sok in Suratani, though.
Correct, correct, just on the edge. You know, that has to be able to provide, you know, a real footprint for sustainable growth, but there should be able to be the ability to have quality projects coming there. They're not just cheap 3-star hotels built in Khao Lak.
But specifically that Tai Muang Golf, what will happen to it then? What's going to happen to that project?
It's our understanding from the developers they're continuing on. No, they're continuing on with a mixed-use project. And they're continuing forward. You know, they've been working on that project for quite some time, and they're continuing on. You know, we've been in touch with the developers, and they're continuing through the permitting process, and they will continue on that project.
And in Krabi, there was a golf course plan that was going to be designed by Jack Nicklaus, I think. That's now on sale.
There was a project called The Cove, which was going to be a Colin Montgomery 18-hole championship course. It originally was a project that started at 200 or 300 rai, went up to eventually 1,000 rai at one part. I think the final part of that, you know, it encountered the financial crisis, encountered the global financial meltdown. The final 160 rai of that project is now being sold by CBRE Thailand. We think that probably that location would be good for big development, considering that you've got 2 marinas, you've got Port Tacoma and Krabi Boat Lagoon, coming up in that location. So I think you will see a project, but the mega projects we saw before perhaps are not going to happen. So I think that's going to resuscitate. I think it's a good thing because we're seeing some projects which were maybe affected by the global financial crisis come back into the market. Perhaps they'll transact now and be redeveloped, but into smaller entities. I think development appetite's much smaller than it was, in the world pre-Lehman's than it is in the world after Lehman's.
Right. So will a golf course materialize, an 18-hole one in Krabi, do you think?
Right now, on that side, it would be doubtful, but we are seeing a 9-hole course which is opening just near the airport. It's being developed privately. So that's going to be another 9-hole course there. You've got a new international hospital, which is going to come online in Krabi town as well. So I think that's a good development. So Krabi is slowly assembling, the needed demand generators. I think the international school would be the next thing, and some more residential development. But we are seeing, certainly south of town, down, all the way going down to Pakisai, we're seeing more development in Hadiao as well.
Casino, this idea of having a casino perhaps on a offshore island or a duty-free zone or something like that. Does this region really need it? Is it viable, or is it morally not acceptable for this area?
I think, in terms of, I'm of the view that, certainly ties, if you go down to Resorts World in Singapore, you've got a Marina Bay Sands, or you cross the river, the Mekong into Laos, or you go to Cambodia and you see the Thais who are going across the river to gamble or fly to Singapore to gamble. It has to be a reality. It's an economic reality. For my issue would be, has Thailand left it too long? Gaming in a sense of when it's built on a scalable and it's done properly can enhance. Singapore has provided a great model for that. Macau is a different model, certainly, but Singapore is a case where it enhances tourism. It's a big demand generator. I guess the issue of is, Thais are going to gamble one way or another. Should you find a way for them to do it in a controlled environment and to help stimulate a portion of the tourism market, or should you let all those tourists go to Singapore and do it there? I think it's that's really a national issue, and I think it's certainly going to be a compelling issue for Thais. But the point is that they may have left it too long. Vietnam has really addressed that. There's the MGM project in Ho Tram, just near Ho Chi Minh City, and there's another project in Da Nang, which is being put in by Genting Highlands, who are behind Resorts World. Those are 2 big projects which are already going into the ground and are being realized. So again, you're having tourism, taking a long-term view towards tourism. If Thailand is going to address long-term tourism, there has to be more demand generators. I don't think you can ignore the gambling issue. It's something which at least should be discussed and thought about and taken on a national agenda, and saying, should there be gambling or some kind of gaming in Thailand, but put forward to the people rather than just simply saying, well, no, we're not going to do anything about it, because you can't ignore it. But I think it's something that requires thoughtful discussion for tourism officials to look at tourism and gaming.
If it wasn't too late and it was going to happen, where should it be?
I think certainly, in terms of areas, if you were going to game, you're not going to put it offshore necessarily. You're going to put it where tourism can get, and it's going to enhance the tourism business. You would zone it properly. A place like Patong would be certainly a place which you would consider areas that you can redevelop. An area like Patong really reeks that you could redevelop Patong into high-rise tourism. Right now you have small shop houses, you have everywhere else. Why not rezone certain areas and let mass tourism come in a sustainable way? Certain areas of Pattaya, certainly in terms of that, you have 7 million visitors a year which visit Pattaya. In Patong, you're going to have 50% of the hotel supply. In Phuket, why not create another demand generator? Let it be in a certain area already. Whether I think something we look at, which is important when we look at Bali versus Phuket, is that Thailand. Why is Bali trading so much better than Phuket? And in terms of Thailand, would be sex tourism. That's an issue we don't like to discuss or ignore, and saying, but does that drag down image Thailand? Is it worse to be a sex tourism destination or a gaming destination? That's a very provocative question, because in terms of Bali, you don't have necessarily, you have the numbers there for tourism and everything else, and it's sustainable. They don't have that face to it. When people say Pattaya, it's a bad word. All of a sudden people are saying, oh my God. So I think putting that forward and saying how is Thailand going to be, these are entertainment districts, be Pattaya and Patong. What's going to be the face of entertainment in the future? Is Thailand going to continue to allow, a certain element go through the market for that type of tourism, or are they going to change that? How do they progress? So I think, if you don't allow necessarily, the large-scale go-go bars, the large-scale massage parlors and everything else, how do you make a transition? Do you simply outlaw it and say, don't come to Thailand? Or do you say, let's tap into another market, maybe with gaming or something else? How do you find a balance? I think Singapore at least has a balance. They found a balance to that. I think Thailand needs to leverage out and look a step further, not what's happened in the past 20 years or 30 years for tourism, what's attracted people here. People like it. It's a fun place to come. There's a reason why Patong is full. It's a great place to come. It fits people's attraction. There's hotel rooms, and it's fairly inexpensive. There's shopping. It has nightlife. But in terms of that, would gaming enhance it? Certainly. Would you be able to sponsor? I mean, the government right now, the new government of Shinawatra, how is she going to raise tax revenue? And either is it just income tax or could it be gaming tax?
I mean, the new convention centre, which is supposed to be still going ahead in Macau and near the border of Phang Nga. I mean, again, is that a good location? But also, perhaps it could be combined with a casino.
It's certainly, in terms of that, it certainly could be, in terms of that. And certainly for the government to capture, again, to fill a debt surplus, to actually do that instead of making business shoulder the infrastructure projects and everywhere else, that's a key incentive. The money has to come from somewhere. For the government to undertake mega projects and do mega infrastructure improvements, where does the money come from? It's certainly taxation, but it can't be taxed necessarily at business, because business has been hampered over the past few years because of the red shirts, the yellow shirts, the political gyrations and everything else in the greater world. So how do you gain revenue? Certainly could be, the convention center. We believe the convention center will eventually come up, and we believe that a private convention center in Fisherman's Village Complex, Fisherman's Harbor in Patong certainly will come up as well. We think those are going to be two great enhancements to the area, but there has to be other things to do as well. Conventions aren't the one-all end-all projects. There has to be more infrastructure, more demand generators. There has to be more for people to do.
Well, one more thing about Patong then. If it really has to be developed, or is developed even more, does it need this tunnel, or does it need some alternative transport?
I think without a doubt there has to be a way into Patong without going over the hill on a two-lane road. When we looked at what was presented for the light rail system, it looks good in terms of that they've logically followed. There is a gridlock issue on Phuket. You've got the coastal roads, which can't get bigger. You've got the main arteries, and either you have to go on top of the road, or you have to go, that's really the only way. So to get through to Patong, to bring large amounts, not have disruptions, the tunnel makes sense. For us, maybe for me as a layman, I look at that and, I've seen other places like Cebu in the Philippines, which is a resort destination. The city became an urban model, in terms of its growth, and they went to overpasses and bypasses, and that was a good way to do it. I think there was a lot of negative comments recently in the press. I didn't understand that from hotel people and tourism people saying, flyovers would be negative. To me, it's already, in terms of the visual pollution and everything else to the island, it's already there. Waiting in traffic is going to be no better. Flyovers, to me, are the logical solution. A north-south highway, which goes above ground to transport people, is a logical way. I don't think in terms of a BTS-type light rail system, I'm skeptical on that.
As long as they make the flyovers beautiful and maybe green or lots of flowers or something over it, surely you can still have beautiful flowers.
But to me it makes sense because as anybody can see, people are going to continue to drive. It's not a urban environment. This is not Bangkok. In terms of that, you're on an island. Bali is 3.5 million people. We're less than 1 million people, certainly. And it makes sense to make flyovers because every big intersection is where the traffic jams occur. But to me, the tunnel should be done because it's a natural way to get people in Patong. You can't expect Patong to be disrupted by one bus stopping on a hill. That's absurd. Within 5 years, there'll be 25,000 rooms in Patong. You can't expect one bus to be able to delay people going to 25,000 hotel rooms. It doesn't make sense.
All right, you also just recently been to Bali. Is there anything Phuket and the Yandaman can learn from Bali?
I think they can also see what's happening in Bali is very similar to what's happened here, traffic gridlock. It's no different. They've got garbage disposal problems. They've got problems with rising crime. They've got increasing motorcycle deaths. They've got people who are applying, whether they be people without helmets or whether they be tourists going around, they're dying right and left. 600 people died last year in Bali driving motorbikes. I think in Phuket there was over 300 people, so they're having the same thing. To get from certain areas there, like Seminyak, which is a key area, maybe to Nusa Dua, it could take you 2 hours in traffic. The traffic is much worse there. In Bali, they don't have the bigger highways.
So what do they do so well?
Bali certainly has sentiment. In all cases, Bali Bali did, certainly, people look back at the beginning part of last decade, 2000 up to 2005, and say, why did Phuket do so great with rates? Because Bali had two bombs, 2005, 2002, and that simply drove business out. Certainly the Australia factor is huge. You've got other things, eat, pray, love, in terms of that generated more business, but simply there's impetus with Bali right now. They have, it's a favored destination. And the rates are much higher right now because there's tourism demand. People are willing to pay more. So I think what can Phuket learn from it is that I think they can learn that people will pay more for the accommodation. In terms of that, they can learn that the biggest attraction doesn't necessarily have to be the entertainment attraction. In terms of the nightlife. In terms of because in Bali certainly the cultural aspect is much stronger as well. In terms of that. So I think people can learn perhaps maybe from the mistakes that Bali's making as well, and not doing the infrastructure right now, and with a pace of, it's exactly the same that's happening there. The private sector is outpacing the government, and tourism simply is bursting at the seams, and people get tired eventually of driving through traffic and going to an urban destination. So I think the Bali in some way trades, it's almost the yin and yang. They're not the same destinations, but Bali's much bigger. There's a thing, will there be a second airport? Will there be, there's impetus to develop other parts of the island. I think in some ways Phuket's more balanced because we're seeing greater development on the east coast in Phang Nga Bay, and Bali is still concentrated within a very small area.
All right. Well, finally then, you're always in demand for seminars and for interviews like this, but what are the next seminars and events coming up?
I think something we have coming up for Phuket certainly is going to be, the American Chamber of Commerce, the Greater Phuket chapter. We have an event on September 16th with Alan Zeman at Andara. That's going to be open to the public as well, and we're encouraging people to come and see Alan. Alan's really one of Asia's leading entrepreneurs. He's going to be talking about how he's built Andara here on the island and what his view is on tourism in Thailand and investing in Thailand. I think that's going to be one great event, certainly we're talking about. We're doing an event with American Chamber of Commerce up in Bangkok at the Grand Hyatt, which is going to be in September, which is going to be buying and selling hotels in Thailand. We'll be talking about properties in Phuket as well with Jones Lang LaSalle Hotels and Baker McKenzie. I think these are two big events certainly we're doing. And we have the ALCAP, which is the alternative property show. Now it has moved from Phuket, and it's going to Bangkok in October. Okay, and that's being done with a lot of people. I think that's important for the property industry. That's going to be a big event this year.
That's the timeshare industry.
It's timeshare, it's fractional ownership, it's condo hotels, it's a broad base. But I think it's certainly those products are here. We see people like Anantara Vacation Club, we see people like Absolute, we see people like Laguna, Marriott. They're real contributors to the island, and I think it's not just, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly within that element, but certainly there are good operators. There's more good operators than bad operators out there for that. So
you would agree with the recent crackdown on sort of the pressure salesmen on the street?
I think that got out of hand. When we drive through Patong, we see people chased through the streets by motorcycles. Motorcycle sales people, certainly that was high pressure sales. Nobody wants to see that, but in terms of that, probably they should have had a crackdown on all types of sales. There's no worse than walking by, tailor shops and driving by, people carrying pet parakeets or exotic birds or wild animals or something else. I think you've got to apply the same standard, not just pick on people either and say it's timeshare. It's the whole idea of touting on the streets and cleaning up the streets, not only from that, but also from the other elements. So I think that should have gone broader. It was unfair to a point about just timeshare because there's a lot of other things out there being touted on the streets.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for talking to us. And maybe just a little insight. What makes you really like to live and presumably stay here for a long time, and what you really like about Phuket?
I think, as I said, when I have a choice to live anywhere in the world, I think, certainly, I feel at home in Phuket. I enjoy the casualness. I do like the people. My wife is Thai as well. This is where I choose to raise my children. I think there's a great education here. I think it's a great place to operate a business. I've got great friends here. I think it attracts a global audience and people who are attracted to a great lifestyle. So, I wouldn't live any other place. It's not just a sales pitch, because I'm living what I'm saying. What attracts me here. I think the quality of life continues to be great. It's Thailand is a great place to invest. And it continues a great place to own property as well. So I don't, in terms of when I look at that, I see disheartening people about saying, oh, it's changing here, but everywhere in the world's changing, So I think, that this continues to be my choice of place to live.
But you would still stay here, good or bad business,
yes.
would you?
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
To live here.
Absolutely.
Retire here as well.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay,
well, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so
Bill,
much.
cheers.
Take care.